Hi, I'm Eric Rivet, Chief Curator of the Western Reserve Historical Society, and today we'll be taking a look at the eighth and final president from Ohio, Warren G. Harding, 29th President of the United States. And if you're familiar with the expression that you should end on a high note, this will not be one of those times. So here's a very happy young Warren, or Winnie, as he was known in his family. He was born in Blooming Grove, which is just a little bit west of Mansfield, in November of 1865. He was the oldest of 8 children, and his father was a farmer turned country doctor turned newspaper owner. And by the age of 11, Warren was helping his father out with the newspaper. And so that kind of got him started on his career path. He went off to college when he was only 14. He went to a small school called Ohio Central College. And by the time he graduated at age 17, his family had moved a little farther west to Marion, which at that time was a very small town, about 4,000 people. And so by the time he finished school, he moved out west to join his family and decided to take up the newspaper trade again. So let's take a look at how the newspaper industry shaped Warren Harding's life. So when he first moved to Marion, he worked briefly as a teacher. He was an insurance agent for a while. But when he was 18 years old, Harding cobbled together $300, which was a significant amount of money at the time. And he bought the Marion Star, which was a failing newspaper. And within about 10 years or so, he had managed to turn it around. And the Marion Star became a pretty well respected and certainly very successful local newspaper. And there are a couple of keys to his success. One was that by all accounts, Harding was just a very charming guy. You couldn't help but like him. So business deals seemed to come easily to him. But probably more important than that was that around 1885, he met and started courting a woman named Florence King. Now this was a little awkward because Harding and Florence's father hated each other. In fact, Harding took every opportunity he could get to write up bad press about Florence's father. But that worked out okay because apparently Florence and her father didn't necessarily see eye to eye either. So they were married around 1891, and Florence came to work for the local newspaper as well. She went to work at the Marion Star, and she ran the business operations. And she was she had a very good sense for business. She had a good head on her shoulders, and she was also very strong-willed. And in fact, a lot of historians seem to think that had Warren Harding never met Florence, he probably would have been content to live out the rest of his life as an editor of the Marion Star. But with Florence behind him, kind of pushing him along, let's see how Harding got into politics. So Harding became interested in politics because he covered politics for his newspaper. But he took the plunge into politics in 1896 when William McKinley ran for president. Harding decided to travel around Ohio campaigning for McKinley. He gave speeches throughout the state. And a couple of things happened. One, again, he's able to do this because he can leave the newspaper in Florence's capable hands. So he's able to travel. And then two, while he's traveling around the state giving these speeches, he meets the movers and shakers of the Ohio Republican Party. And here again, his charm serves him well. He makes friends throughout the state. And again, this is still at a time when Ohio is a political powerhouse. And so if you can do well in Ohio, there's really no limit to how far you can go, as we'll see a little later. And so the Republican Party in Ohio and really throughout the country is splitting at this time between the idea of patronage. And patronage in a nutshell is, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. So you have the conservative side of the Republican Party that sees nothing wrong with patronage, and you have progressives, particularly Teddy Roosevelt, who are trying to do away with the patronage system. And again, because he's popular on both sides of the issue, he can Harding is able to just skirt right down the middle. And so this popularity serves him well. He's elected to the state Senate in 1897. And in 1904, he's elected lieutenant governor of Ohio under Marion Herrick. And keep in mind, none of this is due to some overwhelming popular idea that Harding has. He's not a man on a mission. This is not a crusade for him. We talked about McKinley and how McKinley's central issue was protective tariffs, or James Garfield wanting to reform civil service. You don't see any of that with Harding. He wins these elections because he's popular. People like the guy, and there's really not much more to it than that. In fact, it was said of Harding as lieutenant governor that he had nothing to do and he did it very well. So he ran for governor unsuccessfully in 1910. And at that point, again, because he is still very popular in the Republican Party, and probably without doubt with some prodding again from Florence, he decided to seek national level. And so he ran for U.S. Senate. So let's see how that worked out for him. So in 1914, Harding runs for the U.S. Senate. And again, based in no small measure on his popularity, he easily wins the election. He takes office in 1915 as the junior senator from the Republican Party at a time when both houses of Congress and the White House are controlled by Democrats. Woodrow Wilson is president at the time. So there's really not a whole lot for the junior Republican senator to do, and that suits Harding just fine. So he did what he did best, which was make friends. He becomes very popular in both houses of Congress among Republicans throughout the country, so much so that in 1916, while still the junior senator, he's the keynote speaker at the 1916 Republican National Convention. So his star continues to rise. Now, he did not go to the Senate with any kind of agenda. To his credit, he did vote for the 19th Amendment, which granted woman suffrage. He also voted for prohibition, which, as we'll see in just a minute, is kind of surprising. So it was probably a political means to an end for him. When the 1920 election comes up, he kind of makes it known that he would not mind being nominated for the presidency, though he's pretty happy being a senator just as well. And kind of like what happened with James Garfield, the prime candidates, the prime contenders for the nomination couldn't get a majority. And so on the 10th ballot, Warren Harding actually gets the majority that's needed to become the Republican candidate in 1920. This is a man who, it was said at the time, had never had an original idea of his own. It was said that his campaign speeches sounded like a string of wet sponges. And my personal favorite, it was said that he was oddly charming in his ineptitude. All just great things that you want to hear in a presidential candidate. And despite it all, he gets the nomination. So he launches a multimedia campaign. He uses print ads, billboards. He has political trailers that run before movies in theaters across the United States. He even has telemarketers, probably one of the very first uses of telemarketers to do presidential campaigning. And the end result of this is that in 1920, Warren Harding wins the highest office in the land. And not only does he win the 1920 election, he wins in a landslide. In fact, he wins in one of the widest margins in U.S. presidential history. And he becomes the first of only 3 sitting U.S. senators to be elected president, the other 2 being John F. Kennedy and Barack Obama. So Harding takes office in 1921, and let's see how quickly it all falls apart. So trouble starts almost immediately for Harding, and it starts with the appointment of his cabinet and other positions in his administration. So he had a bad habit of picking friends, so much so, in fact, that many of his appointees were called collectively the Ohio Gang, because they were just friends from back home. The one that's going to be probably most problematic for him is the second one from the right in this photo with the mustache, and that's Albert Fall, who was the Secretary of Interior. And it was said at the time that it would have been possible to find a worse man for the job, but it would not have been easy. And we'll talk more about Albert Fall here in just a couple of minutes. So to his credit, Harding did try to do a few things. He supported worldwide disarmament in the aftermath of World War I in an attempt to what he called get the United States back to normalcy following the war. He lowered income taxes, so Americans kind of got a little bit of money in their pockets, which certainly didn't hurt his popularity at all. He was, I would say, somewhat lukewarm on civil rights. He supported anti-lynching legislation, but he didn't fight particularly hard for it, and he didn't seem particularly upset when it failed to pass. But by 1923, about 2 years into his administration, he needs a break. You know, there are starting to be troubling rumors around Washington of scandals and corruption in his administration. And so he and Florence decide to take a trip out west. So they tour the western United States. They go up and visit Canada. And in late July of 1923, on the evening of giving a speech at the University of Washington, he complained of chest pains. So his doctors put him to bed for a few days, and he seemed to be rallying. But on the evening of August 2nd, while Florence was reading to him, he had a fatal heart attack and died. And so Harding died at the age of 57. And at the time, he remained one of the most popular presidents in U.S. history. But not too long after his death, news of just widespread corruption in his administration, and particularly a couple of scandals, really destroyed his credibility, and his popularity tanked, really never to recover. So let's take a look at probably two of the most damaging scandals that happened during his administration. Teapot Dome. If you know nothing else about Warren Harding, and if you have even the vaguest memory of your days in school, you probably remember the words Teapot Dome. So what was that? Teapot Dome was an oil reserve in Wyoming, and it was set aside exclusively for use by the U.S. Navy. After Harding took office, his Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, who you saw a minute ago, approached Harding and asked for the Teapot Dome to be transferred from the Navy to the Department of the Interior. So Harding signed an executive order and probably never gave it another thought. What came to light after Harding died is that what Fall did after that was that he awarded essentially a no-bid contract to a friend of his named Edward Doheny. And Doheny got exclusive rights to drill on Teapot Dome. But what came to light was that Doheny had paid Fall about $400,000, which in today's money would be about $6 million, for the privilege to drill on this land. And so that is the scandal that is most closely associated and certainly best remembered for Harding, despite the fact that Harding probably didn't know anything about it, the illegal activity that was happening, and his involvement really didn't go any farther than signing the executive order transferring control of the reserve. In my opinion, a scandal that should have been probably more damaging to Harding was that the director of the Department of Veterans Affairs, a man named Charles Forbes, was essentially selling drugs that should have gone to wounded veterans of World War I, painkillers like morphine, on the black market to make himself rich. And this is one that Harding did know about and kind of dragged his feet in doing anything about. These two together really just go to show that certainly up to that time, Harding's administration was the most corrupt in American history. His administration was just full of people who were using their offices to make themselves rich. So I want to talk about one last scandal from the Harding administration, and then we'll finish this up. So Harding is known to have had two affairs. The first is with a woman named Carrie Fulton Phillips from Marion. They were together for about 15 years. Over those 15 years, they wrote a lot of letters to each other. Some of Harding's letters to Carrie Fulton Phillips survive. They are available online, and they are something, and that's all I'm going to say about that. After his death in 1927, the woman you see here, Nan Britton, also from Marion, published a book called The President's Daughter, in which she claimed that Warren Harding was the father of her daughter, Elizabeth. Harding's family claimed that was impossible, that Harding couldn't have children. That's why he and Florence didn't have any kids. But Britton maintained for the rest of her life that she and Harding did, in fact, have a child together. And long after her death, in fact, in 2015, just 5 years ago, a DNA test proved conclusively that Warren Harding was, in fact, the father of Nan Britton's daughter. Now, Harding was not the first president to have an affair. He's certainly not the last president to have an affair. But I think when you add that to all of the other scandals that came to light right after Harding's death, it was just kind of another nail in the coffin for Harding's reputation. So like always, let's finish up with presidential first, last, and only. So the automobile was really becoming more and more popular during Harding's administration. And while he was not the first president to have a car, he was the first president to have a driver's license. I mentioned briefly that he was a teacher for a short period of time after he finished college. He was the last U.S. president to teach in a one-room schoolhouse. And last but not least, he is the only president who is known to have lost White House china in a card game. Despite prohibition being the law of the land, Harding was known to have pretty wild drinking and gambling parties at the White House during his administration. And in one of those parties, he is said to have lost White House china in a single hand of cards. And this is China that had been in the White House since the Benjamin Harrison administration. So as always, thanks for joining me. We will have one more short video just to kind of sum up what we've learned. And until then, as usual, stay tuned and stay safe. Thanks.